Okay, before talking about the nervous system, let's talk about the cells that make up the nervous system, which is the neuron. So the neuron is the basic unit of the nervous system. The neuron is also goes by other names, like the nerve cell or the nerve. It allows the body to communicate with itself and the external environment. Okay, so let's talk about some key parts of the neuron. First of all, we have the dendrites, which receive input from other neurons. We have the cell body of the neuron, because remember, the neuron is basically a cell, so it has a lot of components of normal cells. So we have the dendrites, the cell body. We have something called the hillock over here. And then we have the axon. The axon sends output to other neurons. So the signal, when a neuron communicates with another neuron, the signal travels in this direction down the axon. And then at the very end, we have something called the axon terminals. And this is where the signal travels to other neurons. The terminals are in contact with the dendrites of other neurons. Okay, so like I mentioned, we have the cell body, which is also called the soma. And then when an axon is myelinated, so you see these sheaths that surround the axon, that wrap around the axon, this is called myelin sheath. When it wraps around the axon, we call this a myelinated axon, which is also known as a nerve fiber. And we'll talk about the function of the myelin sheath in the upcoming slides. Let's talk about how communication occurs between neurons. Basically, the way neurons communicate is by something called the action potential. This is when the inside of the neuron becomes increasingly positive in electrical charge, and this causes a traveling wave of positive charge down the axon and to the axon terminals, to other neurons. So this whole process is called the action potential, and the action potential is basically the signal or the impulse that travels down the axon. So for example, here inside the neuron, the way the positive charge develops is sodium, which is a cation. It has a positive charge. It enters the neuron, and then positive charge develops, and this causes a wave of positive charge that travels, and this is called the signal or the action potential. And this is just a general description. You'll learn more about it in physiology lectures. Okay, so let's talk about the myelin sheath. When the axon of a neuron is covered with myelin sheath, it is called a nerve fiber. So a myelinated axon is a nerve fiber. So this entire thing here, we either call it a myelinated axon or we call it a nerve fiber. And basically the function of the myelin sheath, it allows information to travel faster down the axon. Okay, so let's talk about the synapse. At the dendrite, where the information comes into the neuron, there's communication with the axon terminal of another neuron. So right here, this is the axon terminal, and here is the dendrite. So this whole area, we zoom in, it's this basically. So this is the axon terminal, this is the axon terminal, and this is the dendrite. At the axon terminal, the signal travels this way. Little chemicals called neurotransmitters travel down this space called the synaptic cleft, and they bind to receptors. And this is how neurons communicate. Yeah, and so this whole thing here is called the synapse. And again, you'll learn more about these synapses in physiology lectures. I just want to give you a general idea right now. Okay, let's talk about the structural classification of neurons. We have something called a multipolar neuron, where basically it has many dendrites and then a single axon. So it's called a multipolar neuron. It's the most common in the body. And then we have bipolar neurons, where it has a single dendrite and a single axon. So bi means two. It has two poles. And bipolar neurons, they're rare. They're found in the eyes and the nose. And then we have something called unipolar neurons. So they have one pole, and then it's shared by a dendrite and an axon. And this represents the most of the sensory neurons. So, for example, when you feel something with your skin, this information is most likely going to be going to a unipolar neuron, and then to your brain. And then lastly, we have anaxonic neurons, which from the name, they don't have axons. Anaxonic. An means without. And the function of these neurons are not understood, but you can just recognize their structural classification. Okay, so let's talk about functional classification of neurons or nerves. We have something called an afferent nerve with an A. And the afferent nerve is also called a sensory nerve or neuron. And an example right here of a sensory neuron, you have the dendrite, and this is let's say there's some sort of stimulus, like you touch something touches your skin. This impulse travels, and it goes here to the spinal cord, then to the brain. Okay, so this is called a sensory neuron, or it's called an afferent neuron, or an afferent nerve, or sensory nerve. So basically, the information travels to the brain. Information is carried to the brain, and as you can see, like we mentioned earlier, the sensory neurons are bipolar neurons. So here you have the cell body, and then you have this pole. This is the dendrite, and this is the axon. This is a unipolar neuron. A unipolar neuron. Most of the sensory neurons are unipolar. Okay, then we have the efferent nerve, or the motor nerve. This is when information travels from the brain to an effector organ. So, for example, let's say you decide you want to move your hand. This information goes from the brain, and then to the spinal cord, and then to the motor neuron or the efferent nerve, to the effector organ. In this case, for example, your skeletal muscle, and then you move your hand or whatever muscle you want to move. Another functional classification of neurons, something called the interneurons. They're basically multipolar neurons in the CNS, so in the brain and the spinal cord, and they provide connection between different neurons. So, for example, here we have the sensory neuron, and here we have the motor neuron. Something that connects them is the interneuron. So this here in green is the interneuron. It connects, for example, the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Okay, so now finally, let's talk about the nervous system. The nervous system has two main parts. It has the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And there's also the other part, which is the peripheral nervous system. And it also has two main parts, the spinal nerves, which come off the spinal cord, and the cranial nerves, which come off the brain and the brainstem. So right here, we have something called the brainstem, and then the continuation of it is the spinal cord. So coming off the brainstem are nerves called the cranial nerves. Okay, and then some of them come off the brain directly. So the nervous system, we have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. Okay, so let's talk more about the central nervous system. Like I said, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. This is where correlation and integration of nervous information occurs. So this is where information is processed. Let's say something touches your skin. This information is carried by a sensory neuron, which goes to your spinal cord, and then it goes to your brain. So this information, the thing you feel, the touch, it's processed and integrated in the brain, and then it allows you to respond. So we call this correlation integration that happens in the CNS. They are covered by membranes, 3 layers of membranes called the meninges. So right here we have the brain, and here we have the skull. And in between them, we have 3 layers of meninges. We have the durometer, which consists of 2 layers, right here. And then we have the arachnoid matter, right here. And then we have a closely related membrane to the brain called the pia mater, which hugs the brain. And we'll talk about the meninges later as well. And then in the brain and the spine, and beneath the meninges, there's a space called the subarachnoid space, which is right here. We'll talk about it later as well. But right here in this space where there are blood vessels, there's also a fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. This is where the brain basically floats. So again, here, this blue thing is the cerebrospinal fluid, and your brain floats within the cerebrospinal fluid, and it provides protection to the brain. And we'll talk about it more as well later on. Okay, so further protection of the CNS, the brain and the spinal cord, is provided by the skull and the vertebral column of the spine. Okay, so the CNS, the central nervous system, is made up of a large number of neurons, billions of neurons, which are excitable nerve cells. The neurons are supported by specialized cells called neuroglia or glial cells. However, they are not excitable. And we'll talk about the neuroglia in upcoming slides as well. The inside of the CNS, so the inside of the brain and the spinal cord, it's organized into gray and white matter. The gray matter is basically a collection of neuron cell bodies, okay? We call this gray matter. So this right here, the gray matter, and this right here on the outside is gray matter. They're basically a collection of neuron cell bodies. And then we also have something called white matter, which is a collection of myelinated axons. So collection of myelinated axons gives you the white matter. So for example, here in the spinal cord, this white matter, and then in the center of the brain here is the white matter. So specifically in the brain, we have here neurons, which make up the gray matter, and then their axons make up the white matter, okay? But in the spinal cord, the configuration is the opposite. In the center, we have the neuron cell bodies, which make up the gray matter, and then their axons form the white matter on the outside, okay? Okay, let's talk about the neuroglia or the glial cells. They're basically cells that support neurons in the central nervous system. They have many functions, but I'm just going to mention one function or like a main function because you don't need to know them right now. So for example, we have the astrocytes. They provide physical support in the central nervous system. We have the microglia, which are the macrophages in the CNS. And we have something called the ependymal cells, which line cavities or spaces in the brain called the ventricles. So over here, this entire thing here is a space in the brain called your ventricles, okay? And these ventricles are lined on the inside by cells called the ependymal cells, which are neuroglia, okay? Okay, let's talk more about the neuroglia or glial cells, and let's talk specifically about neuroglia that provide myelination of the axons. So right here in the center, we have an axon, and this that surrounds it, the gray thing, is called the myelin sheath. So what's the purpose of myelination of the axon? It results in increased conduction velocity of signals. Basically, it means that it allows the signal or the action potential to travel faster down the axon. And specifically, it allows for a type of conduction called saltatory conduction. What this means is that instead of the signal traveling down the entire length of the axon, the signal jumps in between spaces called the nodes of Ranvier. So the signal jumps like this, okay, from each node of Ranvier to the next. And this allows the signal to travel faster. And this property is allowed by demyelination. And now let's talk about the cells that provide myelination to the axons, which are neuroglial cells. So in the central nervous system, the myelin is synthesized by oligodendrocytes. So right here we have a cell called the oligodendrocyte. It basically myelinates, so it synthesizes myelin sheath, and it provides this myelin sheath to about 30 axons in the central nervous system. However, in the peripheral nervous system, the myelination is due to the Schwann cells. So basically, the myelin is synthesized by Schwann cells, and each single Schwann cell myelinates one axon in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. And a good mnemonic to memorize this is COPS. So the C is the CNS, which is myelinated by the oligodendrocytes, and then the P is the peripheral nervous system, which is myelinated by the Schwann cells. Okay, let's now talk about the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system consists of the spinal and the cranial nerves. They're basically bundles of nerve fibers. They're a collection of axons outside of the CNS. So whenever you have, so let's say these are the neuron cell bodies, and they're going to give off axons. Whenever these myelinated axons are in the CNS, we call them tracks. Okay, we call them tracks. And whenever these same myelinated axons are in the peripheral nervous system, like in the spinal nerves or the cranial nerves, we call them nerves. Like, for example, the cranial nerves or the spinal nerves. So when they're in the CNS, we call them tracts, which is also white matter. It's the same thing. And when they are in the peripheral nervous system, they are called nerves. Okay, so these spinal and cranial nerves, they carry information to and from the CNS. So they consist of motor neurons and sensory neurons. They're relatively unprotected, and so they're commonly damaged by trauma. So let's say you get into a car accident and you break your leg or something. Some of the nerves in your legs can also be damaged because they're unprotected. Unlike the CNS, where the brain and the spinal cord, they're surrounded by bones like the skull and the vertebral column. Okay, so is the peripheral nervous system motor or sensory? It's actually both. All the spinal nerves, all of them, are mixed. That means they contain motor and sensory neurons. And then a lot of the cranial nerves are also mixed. However, a few of them are either purely motor or purely sensory. For example, your eyeballs, they are connected to the optic nerve, which is purely a sensory neuron. And this is how you see. When the light hits your eyes, it's carried by the optic nerve to your brain. So this is a purely sensory nerve, which is the optic nerve. And then there are some cranial nerves which are purely motor. For example, the cranial nerve that supplies motor innervation to your tongue. It allows the muscles of the tongues to move. It's purely motor. It only has motor neurons. But keep in mind that most of them are mixed. So most of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They have both motor and sensory neurons. Okay, so let's talk more about some other definitions. Whenever you have collection of neuron cell bodies in the CNS, they are called nuclei, which is also gray matter. Because remember, earlier we mentioned that collection of neuron cell bodies is gray matter. So in the CNS, we call it nuclei. And then whenever we have collection of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, we call them ganglia. What's an example? We already mentioned it earlier. Here we have the dendrite of the sensory neuron, and we have the axon of the sensory neuron, which goes to the spinal cord and then the brain. And then the neuron cell bodies, right here, they form a swelling right outside of the spinal cord. We call this swelling the dorsal root ganglia. Dorsal because this is actually the dorsal root and this is the ventral root. The dorsal root is sensory and the ventral root is motor, because here you have the motor neuron, here we have the sensory neuron. So this swelling over here, we call the dorsal root ganglia. And basically, it's made up of sensory, the neuron bodies, the neuron cell bodies of sensory neurons. Okay, let's talk about some other definitions. Like I mentioned earlier, bundles of myelinated axons in the CNS are tracts. So right here in the white matter, these are tracts. And then whenever we have bundles of myelinated axons in the PNS, the peripheral nerve system, we call these nerves like the spinal nerves. Let's talk about embryological origin of the nervous system. So at the very early stages of development of the embryo, there's a process called gastrulation, where the embryo forms 3 layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. The entire nerve system comes from the ectoderm. And for example, the mesoderm is going to give rise to the muscles of the body, and the endoderm is going to give rise to the gastrointestinal tract. All of these layers are going to eventually result in the formation of the human being. Okay, let's talk about the organization of the nervous system. So we have the central nervous system, brain, and the spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system. We have motor neurons and sensory neurons. So on the motor system, the motor side, we have a few systems like the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system has 3 divisions: the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic division, and the enteric nervous system. And we'll talk about it in the upcoming slides. So the somatic nervous system is basically responsible for the conscious control of skeletal muscles. So it's a voluntary motor system under your control. It's a single neuron system. That means it consists of a single motor neuron. So here we have the cell body in the central nervous system, and then the axon, which synapses directly on the skeletal muscles. So it's a single neuron system. And like I mentioned, the neuron cell body is located in the CNS, the brainstem or the spinal cord, and the axon synapses directly on the skeletal muscle. So for example, when you move your arm, this is a function of the somatic nervous system. Okay, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. It's also part of the motor system. It's part of the nervous system that innervates involuntary structures. For example, the heart, smooth muscle like the erector pili in the dermis, which cause goosebumps or dimpling of the skin, the vascular smooth muscle. So your blood vessels, the arteries and veins, in their walls, you have smooth muscle. You have smooth muscle in the walls. We call this vascular smooth muscle. It causes the blood vessels to constrict or to dilate. And this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The smooth muscle in the gastrointestinal tract, the smooth muscle in the bladder, the smooth muscle in the glands, like your sweat glands and the salivary glands. These are all structures that are innervated by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is distributed throughout the central and the peripheral nervous system. But mainly, when we talk about organization, it's part of the peripheral nervous system. So the divisions of the autonomic nervous system, there are 2 main divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, as well as enteric nervous system, which we'll talk about later. So the sympathetic nervous system prepares your body for an emergency. The parasympathetic nervous system conserves and restores energy. So let's take a few examples so we can understand. So let's say your heart. The heart is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. If the sympathetic division is working, your heart rate is going to increase, because in cases of emergency, you need more blood. Throughout your body. So heart rate is going to increase, and your heart is going to pump more blood to the body. If the parasympathetic division is activated, then the heart rate is going to decrease, because right now you can conserve and restore your energy, because you don't need to spend energy at this time, since let's say you're sitting at a couch. So sympathetic is fight or flight is the fight or flight system. Parasympathetic is the rest and digest system. And both of these divisions contain afferent and efferent fibers. But remember, mainly the autonomic nervous system is part of the motor system. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system, as a summary, we said it's an involuntary system. It controls functions of the visceral organs, and as opposed to the somatic nervous system, it's a 2-neuron system. So here we have the first neuron, the cell body and the axon, and we have the second neuron, the cell body and the axon. And then, for example, let's say it innervates the heart. So this is why we call it a 2-neuron system, because there is a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. So this neuron cell body is located in the CNS, the neuron cell body of the preganglionic neuron. And then the neuronal cell bodies of the postganglionic neuron, we call this the autonomic ganglia. So because these cell bodies in the PNS are called ganglia, that's why we call it the autonomic ganglia. And of course here this would be nuclei, because the cell bodies in the CNS are called nuclei. So this neuron here, we call it postganglionic neuron because it comes after the autonomic ganglia. And this neuron here, we call it the preganglionic neuron because it comes before the autonomic ganglia. And what you need to understand is that most organs receive dual innervation. So they receive innervation by the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So for example, if this was the sympathetic, you would also have the parasympathetic also supplying the heart. Okay, let's talk about the enteric nervous system, which is a part of the autonomic nervous system. It's basically intrinsic innervation of the gastrointestinal tract. The gastrointestinal tract is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It has an extrinsic component, which is basically the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. And then it also has an intrinsic component, which is the enteric nervous system, which is contained within the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. So within the walls here and here of the entire gastrointestinal tract, within the walls we have nervous tissue called the enteric nervous system. And then communicating with them is the extrinsic component, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, let's talk about the final topic of today's lecture, the meninges. They're composed of 3 layers of membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord. So between the brain and the skull are the 3 membranes, the meninges, which include the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the durometer. You can remember them by the mnemonic pad. Imagine a pad between the skull and the brain. So below the durometer is something called the subdural space. Subdural means below the dura. And then below the arachnoid mater is something called the subarachnoid space. So subarachnoid means below the arachnoid. And this is where CSF is found, and also the blood vessels of the brain. Okay, so over here we have the durometer, which consists of 2 layers. Then we have the arachnoid mater, and we have the pia mater. And we'll talk about them more in the upcoming slides. So the durometer consists of 2 layers. The first layer is the periosteal layer, which lines the inside of the skull. So over here we have the skull. And then we have the meningeal layer, which covers the brain and the spinal cord. The periosteal layer, it's only within the cranium. It ends at something called the foramen magnum. And we'll make it clear here. So over here, the yellow, which lines the skull, is the periosteal layer. And it ends right here. It ends right here and right here at this hole called the foramen magnum. This is where the spinal cord exits the skull. This is called the foramen magnum. And then the meningeal layer continues. The layer in orange is called the meningeal layer of the durometer. Okay. It continues below, it covers the brain and the spinal cord. So when the two layers of the durometer separate, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer, there are spaces that are formed called the durovenous sinuses, which are venous channels. They contain venous blood and CSF. And we'll talk about it more now. So over here, this right here is the durovenous sinus. It's created when the two layers of durometer separate. They're basically like venous channels. They're very closely related to veins, but they're not exactly veins. They actually receive blood from the cerebral veins. So they receive the venous blood, the oxygenated blood, and they also receive CSF. So here there's CSF, which empties into the durovenous sinus. So the durovenous sinus receives two things. It receives the CSF and venous blood from the cerebral veins. And the CSF and the cerebral veins are located in the subarachnoid space. This is the arachnoid matter, and below it is the subarachnoid space, where there are blood vessels, the cranial nerves, and the CSF. So all these structures here are the durovenous sinuses. I just want to show you a picture of them. They all eventually empty into the internal jugular vein and then back to the heart. So here blood is carried away from the heart by arteries, and then the arteries become arterioles and then capillaries. This is where there is the exchange of oxygen and waste products between the capillaries and the tissue of the brain. And then the blood after the capillaries becomes venous blood, deoxygenated blood, and the blood vessel becomes called venules, or the capillaries, they become venules, and then they become cerebral veins. And then the cerebral veins, like you mentioned earlier, they dump the venous blood into the durovenous sinuses, which then empty into the internal jugular vein, which go back to the heart. Okay, let's talk about the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid means spider-like. So you can see here, this is the arachnoid matter. And there's this small connective tissue which form spider webs like structures. So that's why it's called spider-like. And below it, right here, is the subarachnoid space, and it contains CSF and blood vessels. So the cerebral arteries and veins, and the cranial nerves. So you can see here, this is the arachnoid. This is the subarachnoid space, contains blood vessels, and it also contains cerebrospinal fluid and the cranial nerves. So again, this is just another picture showing you the arachnoid matter in red, and below it is the subarachnoid space that's filled with CSF. That's where the brain floats or is suspended in the CSF. The pia mater is Latin for soft. It consists of loose connective tissue. It has a very close association with the brain. It basically hugs the brain. You can see here, this is the pia mater. Okay. Here, the brain is organized into folds. So this fold here is called gyri, and then the depressions right here are called the sulci. So this is the sulci, and these are the folds. They're basically covered by the pia mater. And some of the cranial nerves that extend out from the brain, extend out from the brain, and they're covered by the pia mater. Okay, it fuses with the epineurium. Epineurium is basically connective tissue that covers the nerve. So there's another picture just illustrating it. The pia mater, it hugs the brain. Okay, it's very, very closely associated. These are the gyri of the brain, and these are the sulci of the brain, which are depressions. You can see the arachnoid right here, and below it is the subarachnoid space.